An elderly fisherwoman and her grandson accidentally sailed to a cliff that no one in the village spoke about openly. No one could believe what they found there. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The coast had never been gentle. Not in any season, not in any year the woman could remember. It stretched along the cold northern water like an old scar, dark and uneven, carved by forces that had never asked permission and never learned restraint. Here, land and sea did not meet in harmony. They collided. Rock resisted water, water punished rock, and whatever stood between them learned to endure or disappear. The waves did not roll softly toward the shore the way they did in photographs sold to tourists far inland. They struck the stone with force, climbed it in white bursts of foam, and collapsed back into themselves, leaving brief traces that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The sound of it was constant. Even on calm days, there was always motion, always impact, always the reminder that the sea did not sleep. The wind, too, was ever present. It shifted direction and strength, but never truly left, carrying with it the smell of salt, algae, iron, and something deeper, older, that could not be named. People who lived away from the water spoke of the sea as something beautiful, something restorative. Those who lived here knew better. The sea fed you if it chose to, and when it took, it never asked why you were unprepared. Her house stood just far enough from the shoreline to survive the worst storms, but close enough that the sound of the waves threaded through every hour of her life. It was a low structure, squat against the wind, built not to impress but to remain standing. Thick walls bore the marks of repeated repairs. Narrow windows limited what the storms could steal. The roof had been reinforced more times than she could count, each layer added in response to a winter that had proven more violent than the last. Nothing about the house was decorative. Everything served a purpose. Fishing nets hung along one side, mended and remended, until the original rope was barely visible beneath layers of repair. Drying racks filled the yard, their wooden frames bleached pale by sun and salt. Crates stood stacked near the door, each one scarred, cracked, reinforced with mismatched nails and metal strips. The smell of fish permeated everything. It lived in the wood, in the fabric of clothes, in the air itself. Visitors noticed it immediately. She no longer did. Each morning began before the light fully reached the water. She rose while the sky was still undecided, dressed in layers worn thin by years of use, and stepped outside to read the day. Clouds told her more than any forecast. The angle of the wind mattered. The feel of dampness in the air mattered. There were mornings when she stood still for long minutes, weighing what she sensed against what she needed. Some days, the sea made it clear that it would not tolerate stubbornness. On those days, she stayed ashore and accepted the loss of income as the price of survival. On other mornings, like this one, the signs were neutral, not welcoming, but not hostile either. Those were the days she went out. Her movements were efficient, stripped of unnecessary motion by decades of repetition. She prepared the boat in silence, checked the lines, secured the nets, and pushed off before the gulls fully woke. The small vessel rocked beneath her feet, familiar as her own breathing. She did not romanticize this routine. It was work. It always had been. Behind her, near the racks, her husband was already awake. He sat where he always did, sorting the previous day's catch with practiced hands. He spread the fish evenly, checked for spoilage, turned them when needed. His upper body still carried the memory of strength. His legs did not. Years ago, before the accident, he had worked the water alongside her, hauling nets, bracing himself against sudden shifts in balance. The sea had taken that from him, without apology. Now he experienced it through sound and smell and memory. His world narrowed to the space between house and racks. They did not speak about what had been lost. They spoke about what remained to be done. Their grandson woke later, usually after she had already left. He would step outside and scan the water, searching for the familiar shape of the boat, reading its distance and angle with a focus unusual for someone his age. He had arrived here 10 years earlier, small for his age, and quiet in a way that unsettled adults. Time had not made him louder. It had made him steadier. He had learned how to move without wasting energy, how to stand against the wind without fighting it, how to listen to sounds that mattered and ignore those that did not. He listened to the sea not as noise, but as information. In many ways, it had raised him as much as they had. His arrival had not been planned. It had not been discussed or prepared for. Their daughter had left the coast long before, driven by the same hunger that pulled so many young people inland. She wanted stability, medical care, a future not bound to tides and storms. She married in the city, a man with confident words and carefully made plans. When she called home, her voice carried relief and distance in equal measure. They visited once, when the boy was still very young. He clung to his mother then, wide-eyed in a place that smelled too strong and sounded too loud. The illness crept in quietly. Fatigue, missed calls, long pauses where explanations should have been. Then hospital stays. The woman remembered standing by the phone, listening to words that refused to feel real until they became irreversible. Her daughter grew thinner, weaker, until the person she had been no longer matched the voice on the line. When she died, the city returned only one thing to the coast: a child. The man who brought him did not stay. He said little. His eyes avoided theirs. He left the boy on the porch with a small bag and instructions that sounded more like an apology than a promise. There had been no argument about whether to keep him. There had been no question. Grief settled into their lives like a second tide, heavy and unavoidable. The boy cried at night for months, sometimes quietly, sometimes until his voice broke. The woman sat with him then, holding him until sleep came. Over time, the tears lessened. The silence remained. Life resumed because it had to. Fish still had to be caught. Nets still had to be mended. Money was still needed. The boy began helping as soon as he was able, first on land, then on the boat. She watched him closely, correcting him without raising her voice, warning him with gestures rather than words. She feared what the water could do to someone so small, but he learned quickly. He had her balance. He had her patience. By the time he was 10, she trusted him to handle lines and watch the horizon. Now, years later, the three of them moved through their days in practiced coordination. The house, the shore, and the water formed a closed world, self-contained and demanding. They did not imagine anything beyond it. They did not expect change. That was why the shift, when it came, felt so subtle at first. There was no storm to announce it, no sudden violence to mark the moment. Just a morning that began like all the others, and a coast that revealed something it had long kept hidden. The woman did not know then that the rhythms she trusted, the silence she relied on, and the sea she respected were already preparing to test everything she believed she understood. She only knew that the water ahead looked different, and that difference, however slight, would not be ignored. Behind her, the boy watched the boat cut across the cold surface, unaware that the coast they thought they knew was about to show them the cost of looking too closely. The sea moved as it always had, and they, unaware, moved with it. The boy's presence in the house had become so natural over the years that it was easy to forget how abruptly it had begun. Yet the woman remembered the moment with a clarity that never faded, not because of drama or raised voices, but because of how little was said. Loss in this place rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived the way fog did, quietly filling every space until there was no room left to pretend it was not there. Their daughter had always seemed restless against the boundaries of the coast. Even as a child, she had looked inland with an expression that carried more longing than curiosity. The sea shaped some people into permanence. It shaped her into resistance. She learned the work, learned the discipline, learned the silence, but none of it settled comfortably in her. When she left, she did so with a determination that felt final. She spoke of opportunity, of stability, of a life not dictated by tides and storms. The woman did not argue. She understood the impulse, even if she did not share it. The city changed their daughter in ways they could hear, but not see. Her voice on the phone became lighter, faster, filled with plans that stretched far beyond the reach of the coast. She spoke of work, of schedules, of buildings that did not sway in the wind. When she married, she described the man carefully, emphasizing his reliability, his ambition, his confidence. The woman listened, measuring those qualities against the knowledge that confidence did not always mean endurance. But she said nothing. Distance had already done its work. They visited once, when the boy was still small. The woman remembered how he clung to his mother, how his eyes followed every movement, overwhelmed by the smells and sounds of a place that made no attempt to soften itself. He cried that night, unused to the way the wind pressed against the walls, unused to the sea's voice refusing to fade into the background. When they left, he did not look back. The illness began quietly. Fatigue that could be explained away. Missed calls blamed on busy schedules. Then hospital stays that stretched longer than expected. The woman remembered standing near the phone, listening to words that felt detached from reality until repetition made them unavoidable. Test results, procedures, complications. Each call carried a little less hope than the one before. Distance, once a comfort, became an ache. When their daughter died, the city returned only one thing to the coast: a child. The man who brought him arrived early in the morning, his car out of place on the uneven road. He carried a small bag and a stack of papers he did not unfold. His eyes avoided theirs. He spoke in practical terms, as if explaining a transaction rather than a fracture. He said the boy would be safer here. He said it was temporary. He did not say when he would return. The woman watched him leave without anger. Anger required energy, and energy was already being spent on what mattered. The boy stood on the porch, silent, his small fingers gripping the strap of his bag, as if it were the last thing he owned. She knelt in front of him and took it gently from his hand. He did not resist. He followed her inside without being asked. They did not discuss whether to keep him. There was no debate, no weighing of options. In a life shaped by necessity, some choices did not require explanation. Grief entered the house without ceremony and settled into every corner. The boy cried at night, sometimes softly, sometimes with a desperation that left him exhausted. The woman sat with him through those nights, holding him until sleep finally claimed him. She did not offer reassurances she could not prove. She offered presence. Days resumed because they had to. The sea did not pause for mourning. Nets still needed mending. Fish still needed drying. Money was still required to keep the house standing against the wind. The boy watched at first, absorbing routine without understanding it. Then he began to help, tentatively, awkwardly. Small hands learned the weight of rope, the resistance of netting, the rhythm of repetitive tasks. The woman corrected him patiently, guiding his movements without sharpness. She understood that discipline, if given too harshly, could break something that grief had already weakened. Over time, his tears came less often. Silence took their place. It was not an empty silence. It was a listening one. He listened to the sea, to the wind, to the sounds of work. He learned without asking many questions. Observation became his language. The house, the shore, and the water shaped him in ways the city never had. As he grew older, responsibility followed naturally. He carried crates, helped mend nets, learned to read the water's surface for changes invisible to untrained eyes. The woman watched him carefully, aware of how quickly the sea could turn skill into danger. But he showed patience beyond his years. He did not rush. He did not challenge what he did not yet understand. By the time he was 10, she trusted him to handle lines, to watch the horizon, to move with awareness rather than fear. The man she had married watched all of this from his place near the racks. His injury had narrowed his world, but not his perception. He saw how the boy listened, how he mirrored movements, how he absorbed the coast into himself. There was pride in his eyes, tempered by something heavier. He knew better than anyone what the sea could take. Years passed in this manner, marked by seasons rather than dates. The boy grew taller, stronger, quieter. He learned the balance between caution and necessity. He learned that some days you went out, and some days you did not, and that the difference mattered more than ambition. The woman believed, perhaps foolishly, that this rhythm would hold, that the coast had already taken what it would from them, that silence, once learned, could be trusted. She did not yet understand that silence also preserved what people refused to face, and that the sea, indifferent as it was, had a way of returning what had been hidden when the time was no longer negotiable. On the morning when the routine shifted, there were no signs that distinguished it from any other. The sky was pale, undecided. The wind was steady, neither warning nor welcoming. The woman prepared the boat as she always did, her movements guided by memory rather than thought. The boy helped without being asked, his attention fixed on the water. They pushed off together, unaware that the coast was about to show them something it had concealed, not out of mercy, but out of patience. The sea carried them outward with a familiarity that bordered on comfort. The boat moved steadily, its small engine cutting through the water, with a rhythm the woman knew as intimately as her own breath. This route had been traced countless times before, marked not by buoys or charts, but by memory, by the way the water darkened, where fish gathered and lightened, where the bottom rose closer to the surface. The boy stood near her, watching without speaking, his attention divided between the lines and the horizon. There was nothing unusual in this, nothing that suggested the morning would be remembered for any reason other than its quiet efficiency. The sky remained pale, a thin veil of cloud diffusing the light so that the sea reflected it in dull silver rather than blue. The wind was steady, pressing against the side of the boat with enough force to be felt, but not enough to demand caution. These were the kinds of conditions the woman trusted, not calm enough to invite complacency, not violent enough to require retreat. She adjusted the course slightly, compensating for a subtle pull she felt beneath the hull. Currents shifted here often. It was part of the coast's character. They worked in silence for a time, setting and retrieving nets, checking the catch, making small adjustments that came from long habit rather than conscious decision. Hours passed without remark. The boy's movements were sure, his timing precise. He had learned when to anticipate and when to wait, when to act and when to observe. The woman noted this without comment, the way she noted everything that mattered. It was when she lifted her eyes again that she sensed the difference, not immediately and not with alarm, just a faint unease, like a word on the edge of memory. The coastline ahead did not align with what she expected to see. The familiar sequence of low rock formations and uneven rises seemed altered, compressed. She glanced at the compass, then at the water. then back toward the shore. The tide had turned earlier than she anticipated, pulling them slightly off course. It was not unusual, but it required correction. She adjusted the rudder and increased power marginally, expecting the boat to respond, as it always did. Instead, the current resisted. Not violently, but persistently, as if guiding them along a path of its own choosing. The boy noticed the change as well. His posture shifted, his attention sharpening. He did not speak, but his eyes followed hers toward the land ahead. The cliff rose into view gradually, first as a darker line against the paler stone beyond, then as a mass that dominated the horizon. It did not resemble the other formations along this stretch of coast. Where the shoreline usually broke into irregular shapes, softened by erosion and time, this stood abrupt and severe. Dark stone layered with lighter streaks climbed upward in a near vertical face, its surface fractured by cracks and narrow ledges that offered no invitation. It rose from the water, like a wall, indifferent to approach, indifferent to retreat. The woman felt the tightening in her chest before she could name it. Instinct, sharpened by decades of experience, told her this was not a place meant to be approached. She had seen cliffs before, had worked near them, had learned how they shaped currents, and hid dangers beneath the surface. But this was different. There was a weight to it, a sense of containment rather than exposure. The water around it moved oddly, pulled inward, and then forced aside, as if the rock itself were directing it. She reached for the controls, preparing to turn away, when the boy shifted beside her. He had moved closer to the bow, leaning forward, his gaze fixed not on the water, but on the rock face itself. His stillness drew her attention back to the cliff, and that was when she saw them. Halfway up the face, set into the dark stone with unsettling precision, were openings. Not the irregular hollows carved by wind and water, but shapes that suggested intention. Their edges were straight, their corners sharp enough to resist the softening that time usually imposed. They were small, no larger than narrow windows, and distinctly square. Two of them, aligned with a deliberate symmetry that had no place in a natural formation. The stone around them was paler, worn smooth in a way that did not match the rest of the cliff. It looked touched, not recently, but repeatedly. The opening stood out against the rock like eyes that did not blink, fixed on the sea below. The woman's hand tightened on the controls. Every instinct she possessed urged her to turn away, to put distance between the boat and that silent wall. She had learned to respect places that carried this kind of warning, learned that the sea often marked danger long before it announced itself. She began to turn the boat, pushing against the current with more force than before. For a moment, the water resisted, as if reluctant to release them. Then the hull responded, angling away from the cliff. The boy did not move. He remained fixed in place, his gaze locked on the openings as they slowly receded from view. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the intensity of his focus, the way his attention seemed to narrow rather than scatter. This was not fear. It was recognition. They did not speak on the return. The engine's sound filled the space between them, steady and unremarkable. The cliff diminished behind them, swallowed once more by the curve of the coast. Yet the woman could not shake the sense that something had been set in motion, that seeing could not be undone simply by looking away. When they reached the familiar stretch of shoreline, the water behaved as expected again. The currents relaxed. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though it did not disappear. She guided the boat in with care, secured it, and began the routine of unloading and cleaning the catch. The boy worked beside her, his movements precise but distant. His eyes flicked toward the sea more often than usual, tracking a point that was no longer visible. That evening, After the fish had been laid out to dry and the light had begun to fade, she found him sitting alone near the racks. A piece of driftwood lay across his knees, and in his hands he held a small knife. He worked slowly, carefully, shaving away thin curls of wood with deliberate strokes. She watched without interrupting, recognizing the concentration in his posture. As the shape emerged, her unease deepened. He was carving the cliff. The proportions were not exact, but the essence was unmistakable. The sheer face, the abrupt rise from the water, and most strikingly, the two square openings set into the wood with careful precision. He had placed them exactly as they had appeared on the rock, aligned and deliberate. When he noticed her watching, he did not stop. He did not look up. He simply continued, as if completing something he had already committed to memory. She told him it was dangerous, her voice measured and low. She spoke of the sea hiding things for a reason, of places that were better left alone. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without engaging them. His hands continued their work. That night, as the wind pressed against the house and the sound of waves threaded through the walls, the woman lay awake longer than usual. She replayed the morning in her mind, searching for signs she might have missed, warnings she might have dismissed. The coast had shown them something it rarely did, and the sea, indifferent as ever, had given without explanation. She understood then that what they had seen would not remain confined to memory. The cliff had entered their lives not as a storm or an accident, but as an idea. And ideas, once planted, did not retreat simply because they were inconvenient. Outside, the tide shifted again, drawing water along the shore in patterns older than any of them. The cliff stood where it always had, silent and unmoving. But in the boy's mind, and now in hers, it had already begun to claim space, waiting with a patience that mirrored the sea itself. The days that followed their encounter with the cliff returned outwardly to familiar routines, but beneath the surface something had shifted, subtle and persistent. The sea remained the same, the work unchanged, the wind no more forgiving than before. Yet for the boy, the image of the rock face with its two square openings did not fade the way other passing impressions did. It settled into him slowly, like cold seeping into bone, not sharp enough to demand immediate attention, but impossible to ignore once it had taken hold. At first, it returned to him in fragments, a line of darker stone cutting through paler rock, the unnatural straightness of edges where nature favored curves. The way those openings had seemed less like holes carved by time and more like something placed, measured, intended. When he worked beside his grandmother, mending nets or carrying crates, his hands moved with the confidence of habit, while his thoughts drifted elsewhere, replaying the cliff from different angles. He began to notice details he had not consciously registered before, the spacing between the openings, their height above the water, the way the surrounding stone bore marks of wear that did not align with the rest of the face. At night, the cliff followed him into sleep. His dreams were not of falling or being trapped, not of storms or drowning. They were quieter than that. In them, he stood inside one of the square openings, looking outward. The sea lay far below, distant and subdued, its roar softened by height and stone. The wind did not reach him there. The space felt enclosed, sheltered in a way that stood in stark contrast to the exposed world he knew so well. He woke from these dreams not with fear, but with a sense of unfinished understanding, as if he had been shown something without being allowed to grasp its meaning. His grandmother noticed the change before he spoke of it. She had spent her life reading signs that others overlooked, subtle shifts in weather, in water, in people. She saw how he lingered longer at the edge of the shore, his gaze drifting toward the stretch of coast, where the cliff lay hidden beyond the curve of land. She noticed the way he paused mid-task, his attention momentarily elsewhere, before returning to work with renewed focus. When he asked questions, they came wrapped in care, casual on the surface, but deliberate in placement. He asked how old the cliffs along the coast were, whether storms could carve straight lines into stone, whether people had ever lived inside rock faces. She answered cautiously, offering explanations that were true but incomplete. The coast, she told him, was older than any of them. Water could shape stone in ways that seemed deliberate. People had tried to settle in places they should not, and the sea had always decided who stayed. When he pressed further, she shifted the conversation back to the day's work. There were things she didn't want to name, because naming them gave them form and weight. She told herself that his interest would fade. Children fixated on strange things all the time. Curiosity rose and fell like tides. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, it became clear that this was not a passing fascination. It deepened, refined itself, sharpened into something quieter, but more enduring. The boy did not speak of the cliff directly anymore. Instead, he observed. He watched the water more closely, noting how currents behaved along certain stretches of coast. He paid attention to the timing of tides, the way the sea drew back and surged forward in patterns that were consistent, but not simple. One afternoon, while the fish dried in the weak sun and the wind rattled the racks, the woman spoke to one of the older fishermen who lived a short distance down the shore. She mentioned the cliff casually, as if it were nothing more than a navigational feature she had noticed while out on the water. The effect was immediate, though understated. The man's hands paused in their work. His eyes shifted away too quickly, fixing instead on the horizon. He said it was nothing. The coast was full of strange shapes, he reminded her. Water and wind did curious things over time. After a moment, he added that some places were better left alone. The words were offered without emphasis, but their weight lingered. When she asked why, he shrugged, a gesture that carried more meaning than any explanation. People had disappeared along that stretch, he said. Not recently. Long ago. Storms, accidents, foolishness. He did not elaborate, and she did not press. In this place, silence often served as the end of a conversation. That evening, as she and her husband sorted the catch, she mentioned the exchange in passing. He did not respond immediately. His hands continued their work, steady but slower than usual, as if each movement required more thought than before. Finally, he said that the coast had been used for things people did not talk about anymore. Storage, perhaps. Hiding. Smuggling, in the years when the sea was both highway and shield, or worse. He did not say how he knew this, or when he had learned it. The words settled heavily between them, unspoken details filling the space they left behind. The boy listened from the doorway, unseen. He absorbed the pauses as much as the words themselves. What struck him most was not what the adults were willing to say, but what they avoided. The cliff was not ignored because it was meaningless. It was ignored because it was not. That understanding fed something inside him that had been growing quietly since the day his mother died, since the moment he had been left on the porch with a small bag and no explanations. He had learned early that the most important truths were often hidden behind reluctance and fear. He began to prepare without fully admitting to himself what he was preparing for. He watched the tides more carefully than ever, marking their rhythms in his mind. He noted how the water behaved differently near certain rock formations, how currents tightened and loosened, with changes in wind and moon. He studied the weather, learning to recognize the days when the sea looked calm, but moved with hidden force beneath its surface. He paid attention to his grandparents' routines, the hours when they would be occupied elsewhere, The times when the shore lay briefly unwatched. He told himself that he would only look, that he would go no further than necessary to confirm what he already believed, that the openings in the cliff were not accidents of nature. He had grown up on the water. He trusted his understanding of it more than he trusted warnings shaped by memory and fear. The sea, after all, had taught him discipline. It had taught him limits. He believed he could read it well enough to stay within them. His grandmother sensed the tension building, though she could not yet name its source. She watched him with a mixture of pride and unease, aware that the qualities that made him capable also made him vulnerable. She considered speaking more directly, considered breaking the silence that had governed their lives for so long. But the words did not come. Silence had been her inheritance, too, passed down as a form of protection. She did not yet realize that what protected one generation could endanger the next. The cliff remained unseen from the shore, hidden by distance and the curve of land. Yet it exerted a quiet pull, drawing attention without revealing itself. The sea continued its endless movement, indifferent to the questions forming beneath its surface. And the boy, carrying both the discipline of the coast and the weight of unspoken truths, moved steadily toward a choice that would soon demand more than observation. The woman sensed that something was approaching, though she could not see its shape. The rhythms she trusted had not broken, but they no longer reassured her. The silence that had once felt like safety now carried a different weight, as if it were holding something back, waiting for the moment when restraint would no longer be possible. The decision did not arrive in a single moment. It took shape gradually, assembled from fragments of observation, impatience, and a confidence earned too early. By the time the boy acknowledged it to himself, it already felt inevitable, less like a choice than the natural conclusion of everything he had been learning in silence. The cliff had not loosened its hold on his thoughts. If anything, the weeks of unanswered questions and avoided explanations had strengthened it. What adults refused to face became in his mind something that demanded to be understood. He began with preparation, though he would not have named it that way. He watched the sea with a new intensity, not as a place of work or survival, but as a system to be measured. He tracked the tides day by day, memorizing their timing, their reach, the subtle differences between mornings that looked identical to the untrained eye. He studied how the water behaved near the outer edge of the coast, how currents tightened around rock formations and loosened again as distance increased. He learned which winds disguised movement beneath the surface and which revealed it. He told himself that knowledge equaled safety, that understanding was a form of control. He also learned the rhythms of the house more precisely than before. He knew when his grandmother would be occupied with sorting and selling the catch, when his grandfather's attention would be fixed on mending or drying. He knew which mornings passed with minimal conversation, which afternoons stretched long with routine. None of this felt like deception to him. It felt like timing. The morning he chose dawned clear and deceptively mild. The sky was pale, undecided, the clouds thin enough to promise light without committing to warmth. The wind was low, barely stirring the water near the shore. It was the kind of morning that invited confidence, that made risk seem manageable. He watched his grandmother move through her tasks, noted the absence of urgency in her movements, the familiarity of the day. When the moment came, he slipped away without sound, his steps practiced and careful. The boat waited where it always did, its shape familiar against the water. He pushed off gently, letting the current take him before adjusting his course. For a time, everything behaved as expected. The engine responded smoothly. The water parted and closed behind him without protest. The coastline slid past in a sequence he knew by heart. The confidence he had cultivated settled in his chest, steadying his hands. As he moved farther along the coast, the sea began to change. Not abruptly, but with a tightening that he felt more than saw. The current pulled sideways, testing his adjustments, resisting his corrections. He compensated, increasing power slightly, reminding himself that he had accounted for this. His heart beat faster now, not with fear, but with a heightened awareness that sharpened his senses. The cliff emerged ahead, darker and more imposing than he remembered. From this distance, its scale asserted itself fully, its face sheer and unyielding. Up close, the openings were unmistakable. The two square shapes cut into the rock stood out with an authority that left no room for doubt. They were real. They were deliberate. The boy's breath caught as he circled the base of the cliff, searching for a place to approach. The rock dropped straight into the water, offering no easy access. He felt the first flicker of uncertainty then, the realization that knowing something existed did not mean knowing how to reach it. He continued along the face until he noticed a narrow ledge, barely visible from a distance. Rusted metal protruded from the stone there, a fragment of something that had once been functional. It was unmistakably man-made. The sight sent a surge of excitement through him, followed closely by a warning his mind chose to quiet. He guided the boat closer, fighting the pull of the current, and secured it as best he could. The climb demanded more than he had anticipated. The stone was slick in places, worn smooth by water and time. His fingers searched for holds that should not have existed, then found them, worn into the rock by repeated use long before he was born. His muscles burned as he pulled himself higher, his breath coming faster, fear beginning to assert itself alongside determination. When he reached the lowest opening, his hands trembled despite his efforts to steady them. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with dampness and the faint scent of metal. The space was narrow but stable, its walls marked by tool scars that had not been erased by erosion. The floor sloped inward, guiding him deeper. He took a step, then another, his senses sharpening with each movement. This was no natural hollow. It was constructed. Used. Abandoned. The sound reached him before the danger fully registered. Water. Moving where it should not have been moving. He turned back toward the opening, his mind racing through calculations he had already made, realizing too late where he had misjudged them. The tide had risen faster than expected, surging against the cliff with renewed force. The boat strained against its mooring, then slipped free, pulled away by the relentless pull of the sea. He shouted, though he knew no one would hear him. The sound vanished into the wind, absorbed by stone and water alike. Panic surged, hot and immediate, flooding the space he had believed he understood. The path he had climbed was already slick with spray, the holds treacherous. He was trapped. Back on shore, the absence announced itself quietly, the way small disasters always do. The house felt wrong, its usual sounds incomplete. His grandmother noticed it as a dissonance rather than alarm, a missing note in a familiar rhythm. She called his name, then again, her voice steady but edged. No answer came back, only the wind carrying the sound away. She searched the shoreline, scanning the places he sometimes wandered, the paths he favored when he needed to think. Each minute sharpened her fear. When she reached the place where the boat should have been tied, and found only disturbed sand and a length of rope trailing uselessly into the water, understanding struck with brutal clarity. The cliff rose in her mind, pale opening staring back at her. She did not hesitate. Panic had its place, but it would not save him. She moved with purpose, telling her husband what she knew in as few words as possible. He tried to rise from his chair, his frustration evident as his body failed him again. She left him with instructions and went from house to house, her voice cutting through the reluctance she encountered. She spoke of a child alone in the rock, of silence that had already taken too much. Slowly, resistance gave way. They took the route by land, the sea now too dangerous to approach directly. The path was barely visible, a scar through rock and scrub that had not been used in years. The climb was brutal, each step demanding attention. As they moved higher, signs of human presence became undeniable. Rusted bolts embedded in stone, concrete swallowed by erosion, metal fragments half buried in earth. This was not a place shaped only by nature. When they reached the openings, the sound met them first. A faint echo. A voice. The woman called his name without waiting for instruction. The answer came weak, but unmistakable. Relief struck her so hard her knees nearly failed her. He was alive. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The boy sat pressed against the wall, soaked and exhausted, fear and shame etched into his expression. She pulled him to her without speaking, holding him as if the stone itself might try to claim him back. There was no immediate escape. The tide had risen too high. Waiting became unavoidable. The men conferred briefly, then made a decision none of them would have considered hours earlier. They moved deeper. What they found erased all remaining doubt. The passage widened into chambers, carved cleanly into the cliff, reinforced with corroded steel beams. Old machinery lay silent, its purpose no longer obvious, but its scale undeniable. Crates lined the walls, some broken, others sealed. Papers lay scattered, preserved by oilcloth and chance. This was no refuge. It was a facility, built to hide activity the sea had concealed for decades. As the tide finally receded, they gathered what they could, marking paths, committing details to memory. Night fell by the time they emerged, the village lights distant and unfamiliar. No one spoke on the way back. The sea rolled on, indifferent to revelation or rescue. The cliff had spoken, and its voice carried a cost that none of them could ignore. Morning arrived slowly, as if the world itself hesitated to resume its familiar rhythm. The sea still moved with the same measured indifference. The wind still traced its restless paths along the shore. But for the woman and her family, the night had left behind a weight that did not lift with daylight. The boy slept fitfully on the narrow bed near the window, his breathing uneven, his body still reacting to cold, exhaustion, and fear. She sat beside him longer than necessary, watching his chest rise and fall, listening to sounds that now felt fragile rather than routine. Every creak of the house, every distant crash of waves, carried a reminder of how close he had come to being lost. By mid-morning, the village knew. News traveled quickly in places where little else changed, passing from house to house without the need for raised voices. People gathered at careful distances, speaking in low tones, their eyes drawn again and again toward the stretch of coast where the cliff rose unseen beyond the curve of land. No one spoke of it openly yet, but the silence that followed the discovery was different from the silence that had preceded it. This one was charged, expectant, stripped of denial. The authorities arrived before noon. They did not come in a rush, but with the calm efficiency of those summoned reluctantly and aware they were stepping into something inconvenient. Vehicles marked with official insignia lined the uneven road, their presence both foreign and inevitable. Men and women moved with practiced coordination, asking measured questions, taking notes, photographing the documents and fragments retrieved from within the cliff. They did not express surprise at what they found, only a restrained acknowledgement that suggested this history had never been entirely unknown. The woman answered every question put to her. She did not embellish, did not speculate. She spoke only of what she had seen, of what had nearly taken her grandson, of the chambers carved into stone and the evidence left behind. Her voice remained steady, shaped by years of endurance, but beneath it lay something harder than anger. It was resolve. For most of her life, she had accepted that the sea dictated her existence. Now she understood that people, through silence and deliberate forgetting, had shaped her world just as forcefully. She would no longer pretend otherwise. The investigation unfolded quickly. The cliff was sealed. Access routes were blocked, paths erased or guarded. Specialists returned again and again, hauling equipment, cataloging machinery, removing crates whose contents were no longer meant to remain hidden. The village watched from a distance, torn between relief and unease. Some feared consequences for what had been uncovered. Others feared the loss of a secret that had kept trouble away for decades. But none could deny that the truth, once exposed, had altered the coast in ways that could not be undone. For the family, the days that followed were filled with unfamiliar routines. Interviews replaced fishing trips. Medical visits replaced long hours on the water. The boy was examined, treated for exposure, bruises, and exhaustion. He listened quietly as adults spoke around him, their words heavy with implications he was only beginning to grasp. He understood now, in a way he had not before, the weight of curiosity when it was carried without guidance. The lesson did not settle into him as shame, but as awareness. One evening, as the light faded and the sea darkened into a single moving mass, he sat beside his grandmother in silence. He did not offer excuses or apologies. He simply absorbed the presence she had always offered him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him without words. She understood that wanting to know was not wrong. Acting alone, without understanding the cost, was what nearly took him away. The distinction mattered, and she trusted him to carry it forward. Weeks passed. The authorities returned less often. The drying racks filled again. The rhythm of work slowly reasserted itself, though it felt altered, as if each familiar task now carried a faint echo of something larger. Then the letter arrived. It came without ceremony, folded and sealed, its language careful and precise. The discovery at the cliff, it explained, carried legal consequences. Compensation, recognition, responsibility. The woman read it twice before the meaning fully reached her. What they had uncovered, and what they had survived, had given them something she had never expected from the sea or the land. A chance. The money did not arrive all at once, nor did it solve everything immediately. But it was enough. Enough to clear debts that had lingered like a shadow over every decision. Enough to repair the house properly, reinforcing it against storms rather than merely enduring them. Enough, most importantly, to seek treatment for her husband that had always been just beyond their reach. The day he left for the clinic, she helped him into the vehicle with the care she had practiced for years. His eyes held something she had not seen in a long time. Hope, tempered by caution. He did not speak of miracles, and neither did the doctors. But possibility itself felt like a gift, one that did not demand belief to be real. The boy returned to the sea slowly. At first, he stayed close to shore, working beside his grandmother, relearning trust in the water that had both sheltered and threatened him. She watched him carefully, but she did not confine him. She understood now that protection did not mean enclosure, it meant guidance. When he finally went out on the boat again, the cliff remained a distant presence, no longer a mystery, but not yet a memory. He looked toward it once, only once, and then returned his attention to the work at hand. The sea accepted him back without comment. As for the woman, she found herself standing on the shore more often at dusk, watching the horizon with a quiet she had not known before. The past did not disappear. Her daughter's absence still ached. The years of struggle were not erased, but something fundamental had shifted. The burden she carried felt shared now, acknowledged rather than hidden beneath silence. The cliff remained where it always had, its dark face turned toward the sea, its openings sealed and silent once more. But it no longer loomed as an unspoken threat. It had given up what it hid, and in doing so, had loosened its hold on their lives, The sea continued its endless movement, indifferent as ever. But the family had learned that even indifference could be survived, that secrets lost their power once they were named, and that what remained after danger was not ruin, but the quiet space where a future could begin. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and new stories coming soon. Watch our other videos to discover more powerful journeys like this one. And if you feel this story is worth sharing, send it to someone who might need to hear it today. Your support helps these stories reach further,